When you build a 2D game in Unity, a very convenient way to build your game worlds is to use a so-called tile map. A tile map is basically a grid where you can place single pieces on. And these pieces are designed in a way that they fit together very neatly, that they can be repeated to build larger pieces. And this way you can build these very big, diverse, creative game worlds with a relatively limited set of graphics. So in this tutorial I will show you how you can use the tile map in Unity and how you can import some really nice free graphics to get started building your 2D games. Ready? Let's go. So for this tutorial I'm gonna create a new 2D game in Unity. So in the Unity hub I click on New, select 2D, create a new project which I just call tile map. If you already have a 2D game, then you can just use this one. Create. So this is our new Unity project, and first of all we need graphics for our game. We need something we can use in our tile map to build our game worlds. If you already have graphics and just want to know how to use them, then you can skip this step. I'm gonna import some tiles from the Unity asset store. So when we click on Window, we can access the asset store here, which is just a website. Here we can click on 2D and then on Environments. And then we can set the max price to 0 to only see the free assets. Now you can go ahead and pick whatever you like. And it actually makes sense if you don't pick the same one as I do here, because then you have to think for yourself how to apply the knowledge you learn here to your own tile set. It makes the tutorial a bit more difficult, but the learning effect is better. But you can also just follow along step by step if you want. So I actually can't find the tile map, the tile set I want to use here. So I'm going to type it in directly. It's called Pixel Adventure. Pixel Adventure 1. And it's this one here. Now I've already imported this to Unity, so the button looks slightly different. I can click Open in Unity. For you it should say something like Import to Unity, something like that. Just click this blue button. It will probably open another message here. And then we click on Open in Unity Editor, which will open this asset pack in the package manager inside Unity. The first time you open this, the button will say download instead of import. Go ahead and download this asset pack, and then I'm gonna import it. Keep all the files here selected, click on import, which adds these assets to this project. When this is finished, we can see that we have this new folder here in our assets folder. It's called Pixel Adventure 1, and here in assets we have all these different files. And inside terrain we have our tile map, and those are just normal files on your PC. So you can actually right click them, click on Show in Explorer, and then you can see that those are just normal image files, which look like this. And the way this works is that we slice this image up into small pieces, and then we can reuse these single small pieces to create larger worlds. You will see how this looks in a second. Now here we have 2 times the same file, but the right one that has sliced in the name is already prepared for us to use it in our tile map. But since we want to learn how this stuff works, we're gonna use the unprepared one, so the one that doesn't have sliced in its name. Okay, so the texture type is set to a sprite 2D and UI. We keep it like that, and if you use a different file, maybe one from your PC, then make sure to set it to sprite 2D and UI. In sprite mode, we have to select multiple, which indicates that we want to slice this image up into multiple pieces. And for pixels per unit, we set it to 16. This value indicates how many pixels of our graphic are supposed to fit into one game unit. And one game unit is 1 square. And 1 square is basically 1 puzzle piece. As you can see from the file name, it says terrain 16 by 16. This indicates what the pixels per unit value is. This is pixel art, which is supposed to take up 16 pixels per piece, basically. If you set a wrong value here, then these pieces won't add up properly anymore. They will either have a gap between them or they will overlap. Now what exactly you have to set here depends on your particular tile map. See if you can find the value in the file name. Maybe it says 128 times 128 instead. Then set the pixels per unit value to 128. Then to slice up this image, we click on Sprite Editor, but first we click on Apply. If you don't click on Apply, then it will warn you and you can click on Apply here. It has the same effect. And we can maximize this window, and this is our tile map. Here we click on Slice and set Type to Grid by Cell Size. And when we now set the pixel size to 16 by 16, and then click on Slice, it will divide this image into these small 16 by 16 pieces. And then we can use these small pieces independently from each other to build larger worlds. So we click on Apply here in the top right to save this. Then we can close this. But sometimes you also have graphics where one image is one puzzle piece of the tile. If there's only one piece per image, then of course you have to keep the sprite mode at single instead of multiple. So the tiles are ready. Now we need the tile map. For this we right click somewhere in our hierarchy here, right click, go to 2D object, tile map, and then click on rectangular, which creates a new tile map. We are going to call this terrain. And this is just a game object with this tile map and tile map renderer components applied to it. But you don't need to understand the details of all of these settings here. That's not important for now. And when you create a new tile map the first time, it automatically creates this grid object and nests the tile map under it. The grid is basically responsible for aligning the single pieces of the tile map. Okay, so the grid is ready. Next we go to Window, 2D, and here on Tile Palette. You can either keep it as a floating window or place it wherever you want, for example here or over here in the inspector, whatever you prefer. Then we click on Create New Tile Palette, which we also call Terrain, but it doesn't have to have the same name as the tile map itself, it just makes sense. We keep the rest as it is, rectangle, automatic, and so on, and click on Create. Then we have to save this tile palette somewhere. We can keep this folder as its terrain, select folder, and down here is the tile palette file. So now we take our sliced image that we prepared, where we set the pixels per unit value to 16, and just drag it in here. Then we have to select a folder again where we want to save the generated tile files. This can become really messy because those are a lot of files. So inside our terrain folder we create another folder which we call tiles. We open this one and use this one to store our tile files, which will create a little folder here in the terrain folder that contains the single tiles as separate files. But you don't have to mess around with this anymore. But now we can see in our tile map that we have our image in here. And since we slice this up, we can use these single tiles to build our game world. So we can put some pieces in here and we can put them together like a puzzle. Really cool stuff. Before we go ahead, I also want to show you what happens if you set a wrong pixels per unit value. So let's say we set this to 32 and apply this. Then as you can see, we fit more pixels into a game unit, but since each sprite only has 16 pixels, it's just too small for the rectangle. So we set this back to 16. So let's quickly go through these different tools we have available here in the tile palette, and they all have shortcuts, which you can see when you hover over them in parentheses. So this one is just a normal brush. You can use this to draw single tiles, or of course you can also draw larger areas at once by selecting multiple ones and then draw them like this. The eraser is self-explaining. you can use this to erase tiles, but you can also erase tiles by holding shift down with any other tool. So just hold shift and you don't have to select the eraser. As you can see, it switches to the eraser automatically. Of course, how many tiles you erase depends on how large your brush is at the moment. Since we have 3 tiles selected, we also erase 3 tiles at once. Just select a single one if you want to erase single tiles. Makes sense, right? With this tool here, we can move tiles around, but you have to select them first. So with this first tool, I'm gonna select this one, and then I can move it around. Of course, you can also select larger areas and then move them together. And just play around with the other stuff. One that's also important is the rectangular tool here. This tool is very convenient to draw larger areas at once. So let's first delete these ones here. And then when we select the rectangular tool and then select, for example, these 3 pieces here in the middle, we can more easily draw them in a straight line. Because if you use the normal brush, it can happen that you just slip up and down, and then it's really awkward to use. It's easier with the rectangular tool, because then you can just do this. Just play around with these other tools here, and then I'm gonna build a little game world that fits into our camera. So let's build it like this. Put the last piece here. And we can also, for example, put a little platform on here where we just use the top and the bottom part. And then we can copy this part by using this pipette, or how it's called, selecting all 6 of them and place them over here as well. And in a 2D game, you should make sure that you always have the 2D view selected, otherwise it can be really confusing. So when we press this button, or when we press the letter or the number 2 on the keyboard, which is the shortcut for this button, then we switch to the 3D view. If your game looks like this and you don't know why, then it's because you have unselected this. Just click this button again and we go back to the 2D viewer, which makes it easier to create 2D worlds. And now let's say we also want to put a background in here, because this blue background by default looks boring. For this we have some more assets in the Pixel Adventure folder. In assets we have this background folder. And then choose whatever you like. I'm gonna use this green one. And we have to repeat the same process here. Set the sprite mode to multiple. Set pixels per unit to 16. Then open the sprite editor and slice this up, because this is also supposed to be used as single pieces and not as one piece. You can do this, then one of those squares will fit into one game unit, but it's not meant to be used like that. So again, I click on slice, create by cell size, 16 times 16, slice this baby, click on apply, close this, and then we can drag and drop the screen file which we just sliced up into our tile map here. Just place it somewhere you like, here for example. Again, it creates some tile files which we have to save. Again, I'm gonna create a new folder for it. Save it in here. And now this is on our tile palette as well. So we select this whole thing. And then we use the rectangular tool, which makes a lot of sense for backgrounds, to just repeat this pattern like this. But of course, when we draw over our terrain, the terrain disappears. Because Unity has no idea that this background is supposed to be behind the terrain. And we can also not just do it like this, drawing around it. First of all, this will not work because we want to be able to stand on the ground but not stand on the background. So we have to treat them separately. But also, these tile palettes or these tiles are not always perfectly rectangular. Sometimes they have like slopes and some transparency in these single tiles. So for example, instead of this little rectangle here, it could just be a triangle and the rest is transparency. And then of course we don't want the blue background behind it, we want our normal background behind it. For this we have to create a second tile map that then is positioned behind this terrain tile map. This is pretty easy. We just right click on grid again, go to a 2D object, tile map, and create another rectangular tile map. But we want this to be nested under the grid as well. Let's call it background. And then in active tile map here in our tile palette, we can select background to draw in this new tile map. So when we have background selected, we can now draw our background. Let's make it a bit bigger. But as you can see, we still draw over our terrain. But this time, there's a different reason for it. Unity simply doesn't know which tile map is supposed to be in the foreground and which one is supposed to be in the background. The terrain is actually still there. It's just hidden behind it. For this, we have to change the sorting layer of the tile maps. We can either change this value here, so we could set the terrain to a 1, which is a higher value than 0, which is the value of the background, or we can create a whole separate sorting layer. Which one you prefer is basically up to you, how you feel it's organized better. I'm going to create separate sorting layers. So what I do is I click on sorting layer again and on add sorting layer. Then we click on this little plus icon and create a sorting layer which we call nicht background, but background. And then we move this above default so that the default layer is drawn over the background, because this is the order in which these layers are drawn. Let's create another one for terrain, which is below default and most importantly below background. Then we go to our background tile map again, set the sorting layer to background, and we set the sorting layer of terrain to terrain. And now they have the proper order. So you always have to make sure that you have the correct tile map selected to not erase your existing tiles. So now let's add a player into the scene so that we can see how we can actually interact with this tile map, how we can walk on it. For this, we right click on the hierarchy again and create a 2D object sprites square, which will be our player. So we call it player. The Pixel Adventure set also has sprites for characters. So again, we click on Pixel Adventure 1 assets, go to main character, and I'm gonna choose the virtual guy here. And we won't implement animations in this example because the focus is on the tile map. If you want to learn about all the remaining stuff, I also have a full 2D beginner tutorial for free on YouTube, which you can find a link to in the video description below. There you will also learn about tile maps and about all the remaining stuff. This video here is just for people who only want to learn about the tile map. So we click on idle here, and again we have to set pixels per unit to 16 so the character will have the correct size. Apply. We open this idle piece, and then we just want to use the first graphic here. So what we do is we select the player in the hierarchy again, and with the player selected we drag and drop the first idle graphic into the sprite slot here to set the sprite onto the sprite object. Now I can't find it in the scene because it's hidden behind the terrain. Why? Because the terrain has the terrain sorting layer, and remember the terrain sorting layer is below default, which means that it will be drawn over it. In other words, the player is currently hidden behind the terrain. So let's select the player, press W on the keyboard to select the move tool and move it up. And voila, there it is. As you can see, we still have some background tiles in the foreground. So let's fix this. Let's hide the background. And it's only this one. So I'm gonna select a single tile in the tile palette. Make sure terrain is selected. And where is it now? I don't know if this was just a bug or if I actually deleted it, but nevertheless, if there's a tile here, make sure you have the correct tile map selected and then just delete it either with the eraser or by holding shift down. So, of course, now when we start the game, the player will just float in the air because it doesn't have physics applied to it yet. So we give physics behavior to a game object with the rigid body component. So we select player, click on add component, and we add a rigid body 2D. Important 2D because the other one is for 3D games. And now when we run the game again, it will fall down, but of course it falls through the game world because none of these objects have a collider yet. A collider tells Unity that two objects are not supposed to go through each other. So again, with the player selected, we add another component, which is a box collider 2D. Which makes sense because the sprite or the character is somewhat rectangular. So here we click on this little icon, edit collider, and then we can set the boundaries of this collider properly. Somewhat like this. Doesn't have to be perfect for this tutorial. And I also drag it in a bit from the bottom so we don't have a gap here. Maybe like this. Should be fine. But we will still fall through the floor because the terrain doesn't have a collider yet. Because Unity can't know by default that this is supposed to stop our player. So next we click on the terrain and we want to add a collider here as well. So with the terrain selected, we click on add component again. And for tilemaps, we have a special tilemap collider, which takes the shape of the tiles into account for the boundaries. So when we add this, we have all these small green boxes here, which are the colliders of the single pieces. You can see it better if you untick the tilemap renderer. Just make sure to activate it again. But using it like this is actually not very efficient because we actually don't need a separate collider for every single piece. First of all, it makes the game more computation heavy. But this can also be buggy as far as I know, because the character could be stuck between two colliders. So the next step we do is we add another component to the terrain tilemap, which is called composite collider 2D. And when we now go to the tilemap collider again and select used by composite, you can see that all these little green boxes disappear, and now we only have one large green box around the whole tilemap, and this is exactly what we want. But we are still not done, because when we hit play again, the whole game world falls down. This happens because when we add a composite collider to the terrain, a rigid body component is automatically added as well, because the composite collider needs the rigid body in order to work, and rigid body means physics, and physics means gravity. And gravity means falling down. But to fix this, we simply have to change the body type from dynamic to static, which means that this rigid body will just keep its place. And now the player will fall on the game world, and the game world stays where it is. But of course we don't want to have a collider on the background, because we want to be able to walk right in front of it. Now let's also add a simple player movement script so that we can walk on this world. So on the player, we add a new component, which I'm gonna call player movement, and it's our own C# script. Again, I don't want to go into detail here. If you want to learn more about this, you can watch my beginner tutorial. I open the script, and I'm also just gonna copy paste the code here, because it's not the focus of this tutorial. If you want, you can pause the video and type it out, or learn it in my beginner tutorial. So, gonna save this, go back to Unity, and I'm also gonna increase the gravity scale of the rigid body of the player, so when we jump it falls down a bit faster. And now we can walk around with this player, but again we don't have animations. And let's also freeze the rotation of the player so it doesn't fall over. So rigid body, constraints, freeze rotation Z. Let's also make the camera follow the player. Very simply by nesting the camera under the player, so it will automatically follow it. And then we can walk on our game world, really nice. And now let's say we have a piece with some transparency in it like this. But I don't want to be able to jump on this thing. Instead, I want to be able to walk right in front of it. So now, of course, when we put it on the terrain time map, we can jump on it. But let's say I don't want this. I want this to be in the background. The problem is we can't put this on the background time map either because it has transparency in it. And then the blue background will be visible behind it. But we already know how to fix this. We have to create a third time map that is in front of the background but still behind the player and behind the terrain. So let's repeat this once again. Right click on grid, 2D object, time map rectangular. Let's call it over background. And let's also order them better. This is not necessary, but it makes sense to keep the order in which they are actually drawn. Just for better organization. So like this, background over background terrain. I'm not going to give this over background its own sorting layer. Instead, I'm going to choose background and set order in layer to 1. Which means that it will be drawn on the background sorting layer, but in front of the background time map, which has order in layer 0. So now we can draw this on here. We don't see the transparency, the blue background behind it, but it's also in the background so that we can not jump on it. There still exists one bug in here, but this is not directly related to time map. And that is we can actually stick to the sides of a platform by jumping and then just pressing into the direction of the wall. So we can stick to this. I will actually create a separate tutorial on this, and I will put a link to this new tutorial into the end card of this video. So at the end of this video there will be 2 little cards, and one of them will point to the other tutorial that fixes this problem. So this was an introduction into the topic of tile maps in Unity. I hope this was helpful. If it was, please take a second and leave a like under this video. It really helps the video get more exposure. Also subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet. And remember, if you want to learn the whole process of building a 2D game, including tile map and player movement and so on, there's a full free tutorial link in the video description below. You can go ahead and watch this. I hope you like it. And then I hope I see you in future videos. Take care.